Chapter 3 Campus Sleuthing. "George Fane," Nancy said, "you are about to become Chi-Che Soong." "What?" George cried out. Nancy smiled. "I'm sure that with a little change in your hairstyle, you could pass for Chi-Che. We'll shape your eyebrows and make them heavier. We'll place a bit of rouge high on your cheekbones and change that boyish hairdo of yours into a pixie cut." Nancy picked up the picture of Chi-Che. "Look at this photograph and tell me what you think." After the others had studied it a moment, Bess gave Nancy a hug. "You're a genius! It wouldn't be hard to do at all, and if George puts on the dress Chi-Che's wearing in the picture, I'll bet people will think she's Chi-Che, at least from a distance. Nancy, what do you have in mind for George to do?" Nancy said that first they must get Grandpa Soong's consent to keep the door between the two apartments unlocked. After George was made up, she was to leave by way of the Soong's entrance. "Bess, you and I will follow at a distance and see if anyone is trailing her." "You mean I'm just to walk up one street and down another and wait to be hit on the head?" George asked with a grin. "Oh, do be sensible," Nancy begged. "I haven't decided yet where I'd like you to go, but please don't leave this apartment until you go out dressed as Chi-Che Soong." "I won't mind," said George. "There are some good books here to read. But you know me, I like action, so don't make it too long." Bess now spoke up. "I was under the impression, Nancy, that you thought Chi-Che was a prisoner. But if George is going to parade around the streets," she added, "this puts a different light on the mystery. You don't think Chi-Che is being held after all, do you, Nancy?" Nancy said she had not reached a conclusion as yet. Chi-Che may be a prisoner, or she may only be in hiding. But if the person from whom she's hiding thinks he sees her on the street, we may be able to find out something worthwhile. Aunt Eloise and the cousins approved Nancy's idea, and George said she would be willing to undertake the experiment. "Then the next thing," said Aunt Eloise, "is for me to go next door and make the arrangements with Grandpa Soong." She left, and the girls continued to talk about the mystery until her return. "I had no trouble at all," Miss Drew reported. "Grandpa Soong was delighted to accept our invitation, and incidentally, we are to call him when supper is ready. The door is unbolted now on his side. Come, I want to show you something exquisite." Aunt Eloise went to the connecting door and unlocked it from her apartment. Directly behind the door hung a large silk scroll which reached to the floor. "This is a perfect screen," Miss Drew remarked. "Anyone coming into the Soong apartment wouldn't know there was a door behind it." Nancy and her friends squeezed past the scroll and stepped into the Soong living room. The elderly man was not around, and Aunt Eloise whispered that he was writing in his bedroom. "What a gorgeous hand-painted scroll!" Bess remarked, gazing at the lovely ancient Chinese garden scene with men and ladies strolling about. Before leaving the apartment, Nancy and the other girls took a quick glance around. The room was tastefully furnished with a Chinese teakwood table, chest, and chairs. There were hand-painted parchment shades on the lamps, and the floor was almost entirely covered by a heavy oriental rug, richly colored in blue and tawny yellow, and bordered with a floral design. "There are 2 bedrooms and a kitchen," Aunt Eloise explained. "Grandpa Soong does all his writing in his bedroom." Quietly, the visitors went back to Miss Drew's apartment, and the girls unpacked their clothes. Presently, preparations for supper were started, and when everything was ready, Miss Drew went to call Grandpa Soong. As she brought him in, the teacher teasingly remarked that it was hard to get him away from his writing. "Perhaps we shouldn't ask," she said to him, "but if we promise not to tell, will you give us an idea of what you were adding to your manuscript this afternoon?" The elderly Chinese smiled, put his fingers together, and looked into space. "The manuscript is finished, but I want to write a foreword. I am sure there is no harm in revealing the material I inserted. It is known to many people. In my archaeological work, I dug up an ancient frieze. Until my book is printed, no one will know its exact origin. On the frieze, he continued, is pictured one of the early heroes of Chinese history, Fu Xi. He lived over 4,800 years ago. Whew! George cried out. He's a prehistoric man, no less. What did he look like? Once more, Grandpa Soong's eyes twinkled. Fu Xi had the head of a man and the body of a dragon. Ugh, Bess remarked. I'm glad there aren't any such people around today. What did this man do? Legend tells us that he was the king. He had 6 counselors, all of them dragons. In fact, there was a line of kings called the Man-Kings, who had faces of men and bodies of dragons. This probably explains why China has often been called Dragonland. Where is this frieze now? Nancy queried. In a museum in China. Grandpa Soong suddenly looked pensive. I hope to be able to go back home sometime and see it. As soon as the group had finished eating supper, Grandpa Soong expressed his thanks for their hospitality, then said he would like to return to his own apartment and do more writing. By 10:30, Miss Drew and her guests were sound asleep. All were up early the next morning. After Miss Drew had left for school, Bess said to Nancy, "What's on our girl detectives calendar?" I thought you and I might go to Stromberg's bookshop and see if we can pick up a clue about Chi-Chi. If we fail, then George can take over. The 2 girls set out, and after walking a few blocks, came to Stromberg's bookshop. There was 1 woman customer inside, but no sales clerk. Seeing the girls, the woman, who was portly and unbecomingly dressed in a ruffled blouse and bouffant skirt and carrying her coat on her arm, came up to them immediately. "This is most annoying," she complained. "I don't know where Mr. Stromberg can be, and I'm in a great hurry. I come here often, and it's always the same story. Nobody to wait on me." Nancy and Bess merely smiled, wondering why the woman bothered to come back if she were displeased with the service. As if reading their thoughts, she said, "But Mr. Stromberg has such a fine collection of foreign books that I hate to go elsewhere." She smiled in a tolerant sort of way, however, and said, "But Mr. Horace Truesdale is not one to lose her temper. No doubt Mr. Stromberg has a good reason for not being here." "Doesn't Mr. Stromberg have a sales clerk?" Bess asked Mrs. Truesdale. "I believe so, but she's a college student. Doesn't work here full time." The girls began to look around at the books on the shelves, trying to conceal their own impatience for the owner's return. Mrs. Truesdale kept up a constant chatter. "Have you ever been to the Orient?" she asked the girls. When they shook their heads, the woman went on. "I'm planning to go myself with one of the tourist groups. That's why I'm here, looking for books on the Orient." Idly, she picked several volumes from a shelf and started to leaf through them. "Oh dear, where is Mr. Stromberg? I've been here 10 minutes. When the girls made no comment, Mrs. Truesdale said, "I suppose I'm an idiot to go abroad. Air travel doesn't agree with me. Besides, I hate being away from my family for such a long time." Nancy and Bess smiled in spite of themselves. When Mrs. Truesdale moved away, Bess whispered, "I'll bet that woman's a pest. I should think her family would be glad to see her go away for a while." Finally, Mr. Stromberg came in from the street. He was about 50 years old, of medium height and build, and had piercing blue eyes, a high forehead, and a prominent nose. He nodded to Mrs. Truesdale, saying, "I have some books for you. Would you mind waiting a few minutes?" Turning to the girls, he asked, "Can I do something for you young ladies?" Will Chi-Che be here soon? Nancy asked. I presume you mean Chi-Che Soong. No, Mr. Stromberg replied. Chi-Che asked for time off. Wasn't certain of her return either, so I can't tell you when she'll be in. Well, thank you very much, said Nancy. I'll drop by again and see if she's here. Mr. Stromberg gave a great sigh. I wish Miss Soong would get back. We deal in foreign language books, and she was a great help to me. You know, Chi-Che Soong speaks 7 languages. How amazing, Bess remarked. Isn't there something I can do for you? The shop owner asked. Well, not in the line of books, Bess answered. We, wanted to invite Chi-Che to a party. Mr. Stromberg, not interested in this subject, walked over to Mrs. Truesdale, and the 2 girls left the shop. Didn't learn anything there, Bess said. Nancy frowned and admitted that she was frankly puzzled. Chi-Che's note to Aunt Eloise had indicated that it was written on the spur of the moment and under great stress. Somebody she feared must have been nearby because she was unable to finish the last part of the note. Yet Mr. Stromberg said Chi-Che told him she wanted time off, and her return was uncertain. Nancy revealed her thoughts to Bess. The 2 things just don't dovetail, she said finally. It's too deep for me, Bess admitted, shaking her head. Well, where do we go from here? Nancy suggested they make a trip to Columbia University and try to find out something about Chi-Che. When they arrived on campus, the girls went to the office of one of the deans. A young woman assistant proved to be most helpful. She suggested that the girls go to the building where foreign students often gathered. They may be able to tell you something about Miss Soong, the young woman said. Nancy and Bess hurried to the designated building. It was almost lunchtime, and the girls noticed everyone heading for the cafeteria in the building. Nancy and Bess stood near the door. Several Chinese young people came in. The American girls smiled at them and asked if they knew where Chi-Che was. None did, and one girl added, Chi-Che has been cutting classes lately. She never did that before. I can't understand it. Nancy said that she had heard Chi-Che was visiting college friends out of town. The Chinese student looked surprised. None of her friends here is away. If she's visiting, the person must be someone from another college. Would you like to come and have lunch with our group? The Chinese girl invited. Why, thank you very much, said Nancy. We'd love it. I'm Nancy Drew, and this is my friend Bess Marvin. My name is Amy Ching, the other girl said. The 3 went into the cafeteria, and Amy Ching introduced Nancy and Bess to several other foreign students, but none could give any information about Chi-Che Soong. Nancy and Bess returned to the apartment early in the afternoon and brought George up to date on their findings. Nancy remarked, Frankly, I'm worried, even more than I was before. Apparently, Chi-Che Soong had no idea while at school on the day she disappeared that she was going to be away. At supper that evening, Nancy and the other girls, as well as Aunt Eloise, forced themselves to be gay in the presence of Grandpa Soong. The door between the 2 apartments was left open. Later that night, Nancy was in a deep sleep when she was suddenly awakened by a scream. As she sat up in bed, she realized that the scream had come from the Soong apartment. The young detective jumped out of bed. By this time, Aunt Eloise, Bess, and George were awake also. They could hear moaning from the adjoining apartment. They grabbed their robes, rushed into Grandpa Soong's living room, and turned on the light. No one was there. Aunt Eloise led the way to the elderly man's bedroom. A desk lamp was on. In its rays, they could see Grandpa Soong lying on the floor. He was barely conscious. As the group knelt beside him, he whispered, "Stole my manuscript." End of chapter 3.